Thanks for having me here. For those of you who may not already know about SMMT, we are the UK's automotive industry body, representing the sum total of UK automotive, all major vehicle manufacturers, automotive suppliers, engineering and technology firms, the aftermarket, as well as auto tech and mobility startups. So I'm going to take you through a few things today. Firstly, perhaps taking stock of where we are at the moment, and hopefully bust a few myths along the way. But I will probably also set out a few implications for the business models that may be relevant for this particular area of connected and automated mobility, which is really what I've been asked to talk about. So let's get cracking. Firstly, with headlines like this, who needs a crystal ball, right? It's always a few years in the making. It reminds me actually of solid-state batteries. You know, about 7 years ago, we were all very excited because Dyson acquired Sakti 3, which is a Michigan-based startup specializing in solid-state batteries. And everybody was thinking that, okay, they're going to apply it first and foremost in cordless household appliances, and then it's going to make the leap to automotive applications. And we're going to have long-range batteries, lighter, cheaper, ever greener batteries. 7 years in the making. So 7 years later, we are still talking about solid-state batteries will be commercialized in another 7 years. It's a bit like that, isn't it, in terms of automated vehicles, which is why perhaps this particular debate or today's event is rightly aptly titled, are we talking about a fantasy still when we refer to self-driving vehicles? A lot of you will be familiar with this, right? This is the Gartner hype cycle. If you look at the latest version, automated vehicles are right there in the trough of disillusionment. Yeah. Now, of course, if it is there in the trough, it must have gone through something called the peak of inflated expectations. I suppose in layman's parlance, that's called hype, if you do agree with me. And of course, with those headlines that you've just seen, and often, quite a lot of those headlines were referring to technologies that were not really self-driving, but masquerading as self-driving. At best, they were basically advanced driver assistance systems, ADAS. Yeah. So therefore, yes, the technology has been hyped up massively over the past few years. And then people realize it's not that easy to bring these to market, to fully commercialize these. And I'm not even talking about SAE level 5. There are two things that I won't have time to go into, but if you're really interested, we can discuss about these in the Q&A. One is basically SAE level 5 full automation. And second is why we refer to automated vehicles and not autonomous vehicles. But safe to say that autonomous or automated vehicles, I beg your pardon, is right there in the trough of disillusionment today. But then we should ask ourselves, is this a wonder? Because if you cast your mind back to about 14, 15 years ago, what are the battery electric vehicles then? They are the milk floats and the G-Whizzes. We didn't have the Nissan Leaf yet, which was the first mass market commercial model. Where we are 15 years after that. Today, we've got about 15% of the new car market being battery electric, which is excellent. But it has gone through these phases. So one suggestion I'd like to make here is that, yes, it's in the trough today, but perhaps it's just a natural progression. The technology has to go through its phases before it emerges out of the trough into the slope of enlightenment. Now, one of the problems we have when we talk about automated vehicles, and we talk about, is it a fantasy? Is it going to be stuck in a slow lane? Is it ever going to come to fruition? Is that because we tend to lump the technology into one type of automated vehicles, and we just talk about these as automated vehicles. Of course, some people say these are driverless cars. Some people say self-driving vehicles, which we agree. Which we don't quite agree that they should be called autonomous vehicles, but we get the drift. We get what people meant when they say autonomous vehicles. Right? It's not very helpful to lump everything into one, which is why we think we have to think about automated vehicles or automated driving technology in terms of three main applications: passenger cars, automated passenger services, and automated delivery and logistics. And each of these have their own use cases. If we look at it this way, then we can illuminate the applications much better and see whether these are still fantasy. take the first one. In terms of passenger cars. At the moment, there is already SAE Level 3 conditional automation available, just not in the UK market yet. In 2 models belonging to one particular brand in the German market, the automated lane keeping system, which is the world's first approved automated driving system, approved by the UNECE no less, is already available in the German market. And just a couple of weeks ago, the German authorities also approved the technology for automated valet parking to be applied in a car park, one particular car park at the moment in Stuttgart airport. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that in terms of the passenger car application, it is already commercially available. It's not a fantasy. The future is already here. However, it's not yet evenly distributed. If we look at the other 2 applications, passenger services and delivery, they are here. Not quite fantasy, but only in pockets. As we've already heard this morning, yes, in Phoenix, the East Valley and downtown all the way to the airport, as well as in San Francisco, there are a couple of developers that are already deploying them. These are not pilots, these are not trials, but they're deploying them with fee-paying passengers and without any safety driver. That's why you saw there's basically no driver behind the wheels in the videos this morning. Right? It is available. Perhaps it hasn't quite happened in Europe and the UK, but it's there in the States. It is happening. And in terms of automated delivery, my wife just sent me a message on WhatsApp just now. She just saw a Starship robot in Cambridge, which is where we live, one of the most recent deployment locations for Starship. So it is happening. It's not really fantasy. But again, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. It's not widespread yet. But why is it so difficult to make it widespread? Why is it so difficult to actually usher in commercial deployment today, everywhere in the UK or Europe? Because there are a number of challenges that we haven't solved. Now, ever since the very first DARPA challenge, if you could remember, right? We've come a long way. By now, 80% of all the technical challenges, all the regulatory challenges in automated vehicle deployment have already been solved. But the last 20% are proving the most arduous, the most difficult. And it's the last 20% that is keeping us in the trough at the moment. Right? Technology, in my opinion, is actually the least of these problems, because technology problem is an engineering problem. Given time and resources, we could crack those problems. But of course, we're not there yet. We still need to ensure that these achieve a level of safety that is acceptable, which we debated this morning. But they must also be resilient, and they must be good enough to cater for reasonable edge cases. And thirdly, they must be deployable. They must reach a stage where they're deployable in wider operating design domains. For example, what use is it if you have a deployed, commercially available automated vehicle that will carry passengers perhaps just along Euston Road? What you want is to be able to expand it to multiple locations, multiple roads within Camden, not just Euston Road. So a technology challenge is still there. But assuming we crack the technology challenge, we still have to look at the regulatory challenge. And of course, we're very pleased to hear, as Fred has mentioned just now, and the Law Commission mentioned this morning, we are working together. Hopefully, we'll get there by 2025. It's a small matter of getting people used to these technologies, comfortable with the technology, right? Because we mustn't assume that people will be naturally comfortable with automated vehicle technology. So it's a social challenge. And we talk about pedestrians playing chickens or perhaps grinding these vehicles to a halt, social behaviors. And once we've solved all these, and this is where I'm going to get into, I've been asked to talk about, it's a small matter of making it worth our while pursuing as an economic activity. It's the business model challenge. When we published this report in 2019, we showed that actually, in terms of the potential value of connected and automated vehicles to the UK, it could be up to 62 billion per annum by 2030. But the one bit that I'd like you to focus your attention on is actually the wider impacts that do not accrue to the automotive industry, but accrue to wider sectors: digital services, consumer services, mobility services, digital platforms. And of course, a lot of studies have actually more or less done the same inquiry and find that, yes, those value pools, emerging value pools in the future are very much in mobility services, in software, and in digital services. So I mentioned the 3 applications, right? So let's take the first one very quickly, passenger cars. The value going forward is quite likely to be in the form of software-defined architectures. And we hear a lot about SDVs, software-defined vehicles. And some people say, no, 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 that's SDVs, that's self-driving vehicles. Whatever it is, you know what I mean. Self-defined, software-defined vehicles, which refers to basically the availability of features on demand. Right? Moving from an asset-centric business model to still having the asset at the core, but wrapping a suite of services around the asset. Where, of course, this is useful because the vehicle remains relevant way into the future, computing power permitting. And this is quite likely to be the business model for passenger cars going forward, whereby automated driving features will be available on demand. I digress a little bit, forgive me for doing this, but because I think this is far more interesting, although it has got very little to do with automated vehicles. It is about connected vehicles and digital platforms. And as I mentioned just now, the vehicle will quite likely remain as the fulcrum, as the center, as the asset that is right in the middle, but you wrap services around it, leading to servitization of the vehicle. And this is where you start to bring different verticals together. Different data silos can be brought together. Of course, it's easier said than done, but that's a challenge worth pursuing. And we may hear from national highways in a short while. But for example, as you go on a journey, the vehicle is able to automatically divert its route and book an alternative parking space or alternative charger because it receives notification from national highways that there is a major disruption on a particular route. So there are lots of possibilities if we bring all the verticals together. And the most exciting one for me personally is the convergence between automotive and energy services. Now, to the second application, which is basically mobility on demand or passenger services. Quite a lot of people have been saying that this heralds the death of privately owned cars. Really? Even some of the independent research out there suggests that, well, people will still need their own cars going forward. This is not coming just because, for me, just because I work for the automotive industry. But you think about it. In order to be able to deploy ubiquitous automated passenger services everywhere in the country, it is about economics. Now, of course, it would be intuitive to think about, okay, if you remove the driver, then rural services make so much sense because it's more economic, right? Has anyone proven that? I agree that it's a great hypothesis, but until it's been proven and there's data and evidence backing it up, and operator demand and operator appetite for it, then it remains a hypothesis at best or speculation at worst. But there is a place for automated passenger services, as we have seen this morning, happening in Phoenix, happening in San Francisco. Yeah. And the third area, perhaps, is the one that we should really explore in the first instance, because we heard this morning, it's probably the lower hanging fruit. In controlled environments, off-road, private land, a lot can be done, and probably easier to get done. Right? The challenge is always, again, the economics. The devil is in the economics. Is their appetite from operators. Because, for example, if you think about automated delivery, it's been optimized today down to the minute and to a couple of pence. Right? Can we better that by removing the driver? There are, of course, perhaps safety benefits, but at the end of the day, it's about the business model, the economics. But can we do it? Of course we can. Yeah? We just need to bring the people together, the operators, the developers, these new partnerships, of course, perhaps with the manufacturers of these vehicles and base systems. And yes, we need to find a way to pluck this low-hanging fruit. So this brings me to my conclusion. How can we do it? And we think, actually, there are plenty of strengths in the UK, both upstream, midstream, and downstream. We've got a number of technology developers, some homegrown, some foreign players that have set up stall here in the UK. We've got the 6 test beds, physical and virtual, under the Zenzik fold. And we've got a number of organizations coming together to work with government to realize the CAM 2025 ambition, as Fred showed us just now. And hopefully by 2025, we have the full suite of regulation in place to permit early deployment, commercial deployment of automated vehicles. But what we need to do now is to look at the next step. What's the next step? In a very practical sense, the next step is to perform advanced trials. What do we mean by advanced trials? It's to remove the safety driver altogether, on board or off board. They've done that in Phoenix and San Francisco. In fact, they've gone all the way through to pilot deployment and full commercial deployment, but we are still stuck somewhere there in the middle. So we need to get our act together, and if we pool together all the best minds and all the best resources in the UK, I'm sure we can do that. But that's the next challenge. So in conclusion, this is our interpretation of government's CAM 2025 regulatory roadmap. It is a positive ambition, and together, we think we can get there, but only if we pull together. Because in this particular area, in order to move beyond a fantasy and make it a great reality, a distributed reality in the UK, this saying is so true, in my opinion, that none of us is as good as all of us. Thank you.